both within the dominant discourse as well as to remain outside of it, and it's that balance, right? I mean, this makes me think of Faggy Alford's work, who argues that in fact Indigenous people shouldn't be engaging in treaty rights with the colonial state because it's just reiterating the colonial relationship, and yet there's a certain there are both advantages and disadvantages of that depending on what perspective you come from.
Well, this follows from that, actually. To what degree can accountability be constitutionalized or institutionalized in our day-to-day politics within constituted states, as we now have?
Such a good question for a political theorist. Okay.
But I'm not one.
No, I am. I think that there are a number of ways. One is on a policy level that we can think about in terms of how we construct certain kinds of policies. So, for instance, there's a whole discourse in government approaches to gender mainstream policies around health, for example. We can, rather than thinking about gender mainstreaming, making gender the center of analysis, we can actually think about the ways in which the norms of gendering are reiterated through different kinds of health practices. So there is on a policy level, I think that's possible to do. I think it's also possible on an institutional level, and this is more the kind of Razak version of accountability here.
Which version?
The Shireen Razak version of accountability, about people being complicit in certain, sustaining certain norms of domination. And this is through processes of transparency, for example. Processes that allow us to, or sites, forums that allow us to get to be transparent about what's being constructed and who's doing the constructing, what kind of power dynamic is at play. Now, the danger of that, and this is something that Shireen Razak and Marie Louise Fellows examine, is that sometimes this creates paralysis. So they're looking at particularly in terms of the dynamic between white women, white feminists and women of color feminists in the activist world. And creating accountability through transparent processes can be very, very painful in those moments. So it creates emotional reactions. But it's precisely this individualized psychic dimension that I think that I'm trying to get at through this notion of accountability, where it's not about blaming. I'm not entirely convinced about this, actually, but because I do think we need to blame sometimes. But in terms of recognizing that it's actually the conditions that we need to look at, the norms that are being reiterated through processes or sites that are transparent, rather than focusing on the individualized person in this moment. Does that make sense? So, yeah, transparent sites, forums, and on policy level, thinking about what it is, what's the intent?
Jenny? Yeah, it's a little question. You mentioned towards the end of your presentation, which I really enjoyed, I was wondering about resignification, which you mentioned. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that, and then sort of related to those questions you had about who's doing the accounting, what is being constructed. So, you know, what is being resignified, who's doing the signification. And then in terms of meaning as, you know, partially deferred, how does that have any relevance?
Yes. By resignification, I'm talking about ways of reinterpreting, redefining signs. So part of, and this gets at the question around agency, who's doing the resignifying, because sometimes they're done in complicated and conflicting ways. So even though, for example, the white colonizer might signify Indigenous women in a particular subordinating way, that doesn't mean Indigenous women are doing it in the same way. So to re-signify, it doesn't necessarily have to be on the terms of the dominant terrain, but it can be on other sites. So in a sense, this is kind of saying that there isn't just one center in which signification operates, but in fact there are many centers. And this is what I like about the idea of the matrix, that in fact we can think about the complexity in which the matrix connects through different aspects. The idea of it being perpetually deferred is that we never fully know a meaning. So we never fully understand or have a true, complete understanding of the meaning. So even if a Muslim woman identifies and signifies her own identity in a particular way, that isn't the complete meaning. At least it's not the complete meaning from various different perspectives, varying according to her context, depending on her positionality in the norms of gendering, the norms of capitalism, so that it's never, even those aspects of signification that are self-directed and other imposed can be enormously varied depending on the context. Does that make sense? That's the idea of it being perpetually deferred in a sense.
Yeah, it also indicates a great degree of instability in some ways.
Absolutely.
In terms of moments of, what am I thinking? Maybe linking it back to the concrete, moments of political action. How then do you get workings across and between these intersectionalities? If there is this consistent, perpetual movement and shifting of meaning.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that there aren't relevant identities. I mean, that's precisely the point, that identities they take on meanings, that we understand those identities through these various vehicles of meaning making. So that can be very intense sometimes, and sometimes not so intense. Therefore, sometimes it might be that the racialized gendering process is more significant, or the racialized class aspects of identity are more significant. So it's not that they're constantly shifting and so relative that we can't make sense of them. It's precisely because they do have meaning that we need to take an account of them.
You touched the complexity of feminism nowadays. I was in the U.S. when the 9/11 happened, and what really shocked me was how the Bush government made the best use of it as a gender issue. When I guess you're aware of that. When the hijack girl, I guess, exploded in New York, the Twin Towers. 3 weeks later, and they sent the troops to attack Afghanistan. It's really shocked me very. 3 weeks. How could they do that? Anyway, so the reason for the war is to capture Osama bin Laden. Then, after the main battle was finished, what they're talking about is liberating women, and we saw them on screens. Women are joyfully taking out coffee, and it's really shocked me. And I was in a sort of small community of women there, mostly white women, women studies school, and my instructors are there. So they're talking about that's not the cause of war. They are aware of that. They change the tune completely. And but also I was sort of surprised, those white women, ambivalent attitude toward the war. And they didn't protest. They didn't raise their voice.
So it's a question of complicity that you...
Yeah, that kind of complicity, including my professors. One thing is, they are American citizens, and their nation was attacked. That somehow silenced their voice. I understood that. But secondly, I just felt they didn't know how to deal with that. They had a history with their own oppression, and also their sympathy toward black women, but mostly women. This is a sort of new issue then. They didn't know what to do. That's the impression.
I think that's what in a sense, what I'm trying to do here is provide a focus as to the what to do question. And the what to do kind of response is to think about tracing the various processes of privilege and penalty, or the processes that construct privilege and penalty, so as to understand our own reiteration of power dynamics, but our own complicity. And sometimes our complicity is not deliberate. Like, so the examination that I did of Muslim women in relation to black women or indigenous women and Japanese women. So it's not like that's been, there's not kind of a conscious conspiracy, to kind of signify Muslim women in a particular way. It's often a way for different kinds of racialized others to protect themselves, to say I'm not like that because I'm like this. So it's a complicated dynamic, but it's precisely the unspoken, the unexposed, complicit ways in which we become implicated that the accountability principle tries to get at.
I was just wondering, kind of speaking towards your point, so the problem is the kind of liberal individual, that kind of liberal model of individualism, and the liberal individual is like intersected with race, class, gender, heteronormativity. So do we go with a community-based when it's like there seems to be this kind of conflict between individual rights and community-based rights? And I'm just thinking like Ontario and the possibility of the Sharia courts for personal law. Where do you go, especially and how do you convince in a democratic system that some people are, privileged, or that, when they look at, let's say, a minority group wants special rights, and this is what the kind of discourse is around it. So how do you convince that convince people in a democratic system that you are actually both oppressor and oppressed at the same time?
Well, the most complicated question that kind of arises for me when you say that is, why would people give up their privilege? That's, in a sense, the most complicated questions. And what I'm trying to say here is that, in fact, if we're not just pure victims or oppressors, if we live in these complex moments, it's precisely because we're implicated in those structures that we must do something. The question of the must, in some ways, it's much more, it is a psychic question as well as a question of the Enlightenment project around reason. Why must we do something? But I think the whole notion here of the liberal individual being intersected with class, race, and gender, in fact, kind of misses what I'm trying to get at here, which is that there is no liberal individual to begin with. That in fact, the systems themselves constitute these subjects in particular kinds of ways, and we saw that during the Sharia law debate, which I think was doomed from the beginning, because you either had to be for or against Sharia law, where in fact there was this whole kind of construction taking place around that very debate. The fact that there were Muslim women who objected to the Sharia law, practicing Muslim women, who objected but felt they had to pick one side of the debate or the other because of the racialized, kind of anti-Islamic sentiment that was going on. But I also think that the context in which that debate took place really pinpoints a problem with liberalism, or at least the liberal democratic state as it's understood in the Canadian context, namely that the rights of individuals get conflicted, become pitted against each other. So it becomes a choice, choose your gender or choose your culture. Whereas in fact, what I'm trying to get at here is that those things are inseparable. Even though one might be more salient than the other in different moments, that very understanding itself fails to recognize the ways in which interactive processes of meaning-making operate.
Well, I would like you to join me, please, in thanking Dr. Dhamoon for a very elegant lecture, and so please. And the next session is next week on the 30th with Emmanuel Chakuri Easy, who is going to give a seminar on diversity and reason.